Hi, this is Mrs. Vrobel. This is Chapter 3, Matter, It Changes and Its Properties, Part 1. As you see before you, the learning objectives for this part of the video are correctly identifying what is matter and the characteristics of matter, then distinguishing between physical and chemical properties, and then lastly, differentiating between physical states of matter and chemical change. Okay, the question is, what is matter? Now there's a beautiful picture here, and notice it's a seaside picture. Now, you probably remember from your earlier experiences in science that matter has to have certain qualities to it in order to be considered matter. It has to take up mass and space. If it has neither, like light, it's not matter. So please remember, light is not matter. That's really important. And when we talk about mass, we're not talking about how massive something is. We're talking about the amount of matter that's contained in that object. Okay, so what are the states of matter? And this is review for you. Notice solids, they typically have definite volume, definite shape. They're not compressible. As much as you try to push on a solid object, you're not going to be able to compress it. Liquids, they have definite volume but indefinite shape, and you might notice that you could slightly push on a liquid and it will compress or get smaller. And gas is probably the most nebulous out of all the states. It has indefinite volume and indefinite shape. You can smush it down to a very tiny space, and we'll definitely talk about gases later in the year. Vapor is a version of a gaseous state. Typically it's a liquid or a solid that forms a gas. Water is considered vapor. Okay, physical properties. So physical properties, please note that we're looking at the condition of the matter. And when you observe it, you're not changing the composition. This is really important. This is how we know what a physical property is. Now, notice that if you have one substance, one type of substance, every time you measure it, it should have identical properties. The physical properties should not change from sample to sample. Here we have an example of physical properties of common substances. And notice that oxygen, it has no color. It has a melting point and a boiling point. It has a certain density. When you look at water, it obviously has a certain color. It also has a certain melting point, boiling point, and density. Okay, physical change. So now we're no longer talking about properties, we're talking about change. Notice that you're talking about keeping the composition the same. So you're not changing the materials, types of elements that make up that substance. Extensive property, notice that it's dependent on mass, length, or volume, whereas intensive, it's the amount of substance. So, I'm sorry, it's independent of the amount of substance. I apologize. So notice that there's a difference between them. Okay, chemical change. Chemical change is where you actually get the substance altered. So that means it actually changes its composition. An example of this is methane. So this is the gas that comes out of your stove if you have a gas stove. And it combines with oxygen to form carbon dioxide and water. And notice these are reactants and these are products. So anything on the left-hand side is considered reactant, anything on the right-hand side is considered product. What are some indicators of chemical change? If you see heat or light, if you see a color change. Now you gotta be careful because some physical changes are color changes, and we'll talk more about that in class. You might see bubbles. You gotta be careful with bubbles because some substances may contain bubbles, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a chemical change. Boiling is an example of that. Precipitate. So typically you see a solid when you combine two liquids. So it's not a liquid dissolved by a solid or a solid dissolved by liquid. It's when you add two liquids and they form a solid. And then you might smell a new odor. So some substances have their own distinct odor, but when you combine it with another substance, you might notice you produce an odor. Okay, chemical change. So please note, with chemical change, we're talking about moving into a new substance. So you take two substances, combine them, and you get a totally different substance. If you look at decomposition, rusting, burning, oxidizing, these are examples of chemical change. Okay, so please remember that the three most common states of matter are solid, liquid, and gas. Physical properties, you can see them without altering the substance's composition. Chemical properties describe the substance's ability to change into one or new substances. Physical change, we're just talking about altering the physical property, but not the composition. And then lastly, chemical change or reactions, we actually have change in composition.